I've been asked to ask you folks, if you would, to turn off your cell phones and pagers because it interferes with some of the audiovisual equipment. So if you could do that, I'd appreciate it. Anyway, thank you very much, Jeff, and thank you for inviting me here this evening to discuss really a very interesting topic. Nature or nurture. This is a topic that affects virtually everybody, especially your neighborhood defense attorney. If you watch CSI or any of the crime dramas, this is the best argument for a defense attorney. My client isn't guilty because he had a bad environment. Or, my client isn't guilty because he has bad genes. Anyway, it's a win-win situation for a defense attorney. But this is really a debate that's been going on for almost 150 years in philosophical circles, and it really hasn't died down. It's resurfaced recently with the publication of actually a seminal book in this field called Nature via Nurture by Matt Ridley, a gentleman who did a presentation on the genome, also in an award-winning book by that title, The Genome. And so every time a new book comes out on this, we hope we've put it to rest, but it comes back again. So why are we here, déjà vu, all over again? Because we have new information this time. We have the Genome Project. The Human Genome Project, which you know was published just several years ago. And a lot of people believe that now we know everything about human behavior, we know everything about human genetics, and we're going to take a look at Genome 101 here and find out what we really know and what it means. But what publication of the genome has allowed us to do is come back and take a new look at behavior and find out, in fact, is it all nature? Is it all environment? Is it all nurture? Is it all genetic? Is it some combination of the above? Or if we want to take a philosophical bent, does free will come into there somewhere? And information from the genome gives us a whole new light in which to look at this. So my presentation tonight, my presentation this evening, is not developing a personal thesis for you, but giving you some brain food to think about for our discussion afterwards. There maybe skew the way you look at your own behavior now. And this is what I'm going to ask you to do in a few minutes, is try and figure out, based upon your life and your behavior, what's running you? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it free will? Or the person living next door? So what we're going to do here, let's see, let's get you going. First of all, we're going to take a look at how we're going to define nature, because there are a lot of synonyms, a lot of synonymous concepts we can look at for that definition of nature. So maybe the cleanest thing we can do is say, when you behave by nature, it's instinctive, right? We say, well, I do this instinctively, but there's a note at the bottom, a cautionary tale. To consider something instinctive or nature, the behavior has to be pretty much stereotypical throughout the species. You can't say, hey, it's my nature, but you're the only one in the neighborhood doing it, okay? That doesn't count. Another synonym we could use as well, it's genetic. You say that my behavior is genetically based. That'd be the synonymous as I'm a product of nature. Or programmed. I'm pre-programmed. My nature is pre-programmed. I can't help it. Or biological determinism. What I do is determined biologically. I am the slave to my genetic makeup. Or in the behavior business, we call it hardwired. You say, well, that behavior is hardwired. It's programmed. And we'll talk about some examples of these in a few minutes. But these are all synonyms we need to kind of look at, and I'll probably use them interchangeably tonight. If I get to a point where you say, what the heck are you talking about? Feel free to raise your hand. How about nurture? Nurture we're going to define as behavior influenced by the environment and or learning. So we nurture you. You are a product of your environment, or are you? You say, well, I'm a product of my parents, I'm a product of my neighborhood, I'm a product of my church, my community. We'd say that then your behavior is influenced by nurture. So the debate focuses around, primarily, is our behavior nature, is it nurture, or we need to get our third component in here, free will. Free will, aka self-determination. Sure, I may have some genetic influence running my life. Sure, I may be a product of my environment, but it's my free will that allows me to make the ultimate choice. We'll find out if you think that's true after tonight's presentation. We also talk about self-control, which some of us are looking forward, trying to regain. Okay, cognitive independence, right? I'm cognitive of what my genes are telling me to do. I'm cognitive of what my behavior is my environment is trying to make me do, but I have the ability to control that. Well, that's what we're going to be looking at tonight for their definitions. Now, let's take a look here. That's something I want to introduce you to. Let's look at the question first, the question for tonight's discussion. What's the basis of behavior? First, we're going to look at probably two of the stronger influences, at least in some authors' mind. Nurture versus nature. What's the influence on your life? Where would you put the influence in your life? On the horizontal axis, the x-axis, we have nature. On the vertical, the y-axis, we have nurture. So where would you put the control on your life? Would you put it at spot number one? If you said, well, I'm comfortable with spot number 1, that means I'm 100% motivated and controlled by my genes, or excuse me, my environment, by nurture. If you think, well, I'm a victim of my genes, I can't do anything about it, we'd put you down at number 5. Or do you want to be politically correct and go for 3, okay? Or 3.5 or 3.7. So what I'm going to ask you to do is kind of figure right now, if we assume those are the 2 variables acting upon your behavior, where are you comfortable? Where are you comfortable saying that in my day-to-day life, this is how my behavior is motivated? Because at the end of the presentation, we're going to see this again. And we're going to see if you want to change your position on that. But now let's add another variable, free will. And now we get away from the graph and we look at this triangle. Are there 3 influences that determine your behavior? Nurture, nature, and free will. So what I'm going to ask you to do at the beginning here is also commit yourself. Where would you put the nexus of your behavior? Where do these 3 intersect? If you say, well, I'm strictly a product of nurture, my environment, and then my decisions about that, you'd put yourself at position number 1. Where position number 1, I'm just governed by free will and nurture. Or if you want to take the position, well, actually I'm governed by nature and by nurture, by genes in my environment. There's no free will involved. Well, then you're in position number 2. Position number 3 says, well, it's nature, it's my genes, what my genes direct me to do, and how I control them with my free will. You'd be in position 3. If you're completely confused at this point, you'd be in position number 4. Okay? So we're going to come back to this also, and I'll ask you, where do you want to put yourself now? So kind of look at this. Where's your nexus? Where's your intersection if you assume it's 3 factors influencing your behavior? Okay, what we want to do now is take a look at the players in the debate. As I mentioned, there's a long history for this nature versus nurture debate. And we have to start with definitely one of the big players here, which is Francis Galton. If we had to encapsulate his writings, his viewpoint on behavior, we'd say he believes in, or he authored this concept of inherited individual destiny, which puts him where? That puts him in the nature camp, right? So his belief was that our behavior is genetically controlled. He wrote a couple seminal articles and books, the first one here being Heredity, Talent, and Character, which came out in Macmillan's magazine back in 1865. So we put this in context, American Civil War. This was when Mendel and Darwin were kicking around the planet. And in fact, Francis Galton was Darwin's half-cousin. It was Darwin's half-cousin, which he made sure he got mileage out of during the process. So he had what he came up with in his Hereditary, Talent, and Character. He said, distinguished men have distinguished relations, which basically is saying what? Is that good breeding makes you successful. He followed that up with a book called Hereditary Genius in 1869. Basically, the thesis of that was talent runs in families. Okay? It's genetically controlled. His last one, and probably his most important, English men of science, their nature and nurture. This is the gentleman that coined the phrase, nature versus nurture. It had appeared in different ramifications all the way back to even Shakespeare, but really the coinage came right here, where he said geniuses are born and not made. And he coined this nature versus nurture. So we have to look at Galton to say, he's the one that started this 150 years ago-ish. Let's take a look at our next one here, which gives us to, there we go, to Konrad Lorenz. We all know Konrad Lorenz. We know his work with the goslings. Definitely from the nature camp. We're going to come back and re-examine his work through a different view. But as we know with Lorenz, he said that behavior is instinctive, and that behavior can be released during a critical period or instinctive period. This is a huge topic tonight, behavior, and we certainly can't do Behavior 101. We have some great authorities in the audience. We have Dr. Bob Collins, who's a psychiatrist, psychologist who can help you out, and some others. So we're trying to give you the Reader's Digest condensed Cliff Notes version here to kind of get us up to where we need to discuss. But I think we've all had Psychology 101, and we're familiar with Lorenz's work, definitely from the nature camp. Now we take a look at Noam Chomsky, that humans are born with the capacity for grammar, also from the nature camp, saying that humans, that capacity for grammar is inherent. He did some interesting work with some other animal species to come up with this thesis, but definitely in the nature camp. I'm treating these very topically, but each of these folks has had a large body of work that you can certainly refer to. And then let's take a look at Kant. The mind has a native morality. So here you go. You're born with your morality, which would put a lot of morality-based institutions right out of business, okay, if we assume that you're born with it, and that there is an immutable human nature. So there's something that we're calling human nature that incorporates morality that's inborn. It's not something that your environment produces. So Kant would say, you're born with this, part of the nature camp. Let's go to the nurture camp now, saying that it's your environment that has the influence. And we have to go to Pavlov. We know Pavlov's work. And basically the thesis of much of his work was that the mind can be conditioned by the environment. We know his seminal work with salivation in dogs, and we'll come back and we'll revisit that a little bit. But definitely from the nurture side of the debate. Let's take a look at old Siggy, Sigmund Freud, okay, who's definitely had his run. It says, behavior is influenced by parents, dreams, jokes, and sex. Not necessarily in that order, okay? But what does that say? This is the environment camp once again, right? Where our behaviors are a product of our environment. And of course, Freud, as we now know, gave it far more credit than it probably justifiably deserved. Let's take a look at Boas, Franz Boas. Environment, history, and chance are the key influences upon cultural variation. Very important seminal work trying to deal with also racism. He said that the differences we see between races are really not genetic. What we're looking at here is basically the chance in the environment, the history, or the influences that account for cultural differences. We take a look at John Locke, David Hume, John Stuart Mill, fervently in the nurture camp. Basically paraphrasing Locke here, but all three of them subscribing to this philosophy, the mind is a blank slate upon which experience makes it mark. So you're starting out at ground zero, and your environment is going to modify your behavior. Now we get into the third camp, nature via nurture, not versus, okay, but nature via nurture. Matt Ridley, whose new book, 2003, Nature via Nurture, by the same title, great book. This is the gentleman that wrote the award-winning book on the genome. What he's saying is that genes are not the puppet masters that control nurture, but nurture is the puppet master that controls genes. Different perspective, right? Saying basically that it's the environment that really regulates the influence that the genes have. This isn't necessarily a politically correct way of his approach. He's not doing it for that reason. Go, well, everybody's right. Can't we just hug and get along? He's going, it's far more interesting than that. And actually, what spawned his authorship of this book was his previous book on the genome, learning about the genome, and then saying, wow, maybe we should revisit this debate. Now, Genome 101. We've heard about it. We've read about it. What the heck is it? This is the Reader's Digest condensed version. We're going to say, for the purpose of tonight's talk, the genome is the genetic composition of an organism. Now, what is that genetic composition? Well, we start out, of course, looking over here where we have, let's see if we can get this laser to come on here. So over here we have our cell, and within the cell we have chromosomes. In the case of humans, we have 23 pairs, 46 chromosomes. If we take those little guys out, we have a chromosome right here. If we uncoil them, we find inside proteins and the DNA molecule, which we all know is that alpha helix, that double alpha helix. Good enough. But let's take a look at what's in here. These little guys right here we can refer to as the alphabet of the DNA. You folks that remember your biology, you know these little guys are called nitrogen bases. And they're the rungs in that DNA ladder. Things like the C is cytosine, the A is adenine, and they link together in predetermined manners. But regardless of what life form you are, it's those same 4 nitrogen bases that we see right here that make up virtually every characteristic of our body in every organism on this planet, whether you're yeast, whether you're a banana, or whether you're a blue whale. It's the same 4 nucleotides in different sequences that produce what we know as genes. So what is a gene? Well, a gene is a sequence of these nitrogen bases. Let's say, for instance, from right here back to right here, that region of the DNA molecule we can call a gene. We say that's that region that helps produce the coding for eye color, for number of chambers in your heart, for number of feet you have, the number of toes in each foot. Now, it's far more complicated than that. We found out with the genome. In fact, anybody who stands in front of a Biology 101 class anymore and says, this is the gene for, needs to review the genome, because it's far more confusing than we ever thought it was going to be. There's rarely a single gene that does anything. But a gene is a region on the DNA molecule, on a chromosome, that influences some trait. And what is it? It's a recipe. It's a recipe for producing proteins. So what have we done in the Human Genome Project? Well, we've tried to list this recipe. We found out there are about 30,000 of these segments on all 23 pairs of chromosomes that code for traits that we display as humans. Before we started the project, we thought there were about 100,000. Whoops, about 30,000. Now, if there are 30,000 genes there, and we take a look at those 4 letters, those rungs in the DNA ladder, we say there are about 3 billion letters, those nitrogen bases, the cytosine, the adenine, the guanine, that make up our genes. But the take-home message here is we have 30,000 genes that make us us. Another important fact we need to understand is that genes commonly have more than one function. There's a gene in our body, for instance, responsible for determining how many fingers are on your hand and also the position of where your head goes in the body. It's the same gene that does both. It's kind of like owning a pickup truck. It has multiple functions, right? It gets you to work, it hauls the hay, it looks cool when you're cruising, people can throw beer cans in the back of it. There are a lot of different functions there, right? Depending upon what you're doing at that time. And genes do the same thing. There's rarely one gene for a particular function. There's rarely one function for a particular gene. So when we say that we've mapped the human genome, folks, here's what it means. We now know, in analogy, we now know how many encyclopedias are in our set of encyclopedias. We know how many chapters are in each encyclopedia. We have the chapter titles for some of the chapters. We have some of the chapters that even have a couple paragraphs in them. But we all now need to figure out now is, what do they do? And who dances with who? We have years to go. All we've done so far is we know how many genes are there. There's a lot more to happen. Now, let's talk about Venter's folly. Craig Venter, one of the most published scientists alive today, the CEO of the Institute for Genomic Research. He was the gentleman who headed up one of the private corporations that tried to publish the human genome. And there were a series of different labs and governments involved in doing this, and it was agreed that everybody would wait to publish the genome on the same day. Well, Venter couldn't wait. It turns out the day before the agreed-upon publication, there was a newspaper article based upon a review he did several days before, and he actually scooped everybody else. So when that article came out in the London Observer, everybody else went and published ahead of game because there was a self-imposed embargo, and Venter decided, well, I'm going to tell them what I think first. A mistake. Because on February 11th, the Observer said, Craig Venter said, we simply do not have enough genes, 30,000, for this idea of biological determinism, genetic influence, to be right. Because we thought there were 100,000, right? So Venter wanted to be the first one to go, I alone hold the truth. Folks, bad news for you, okay, is that, what we thought was this is not genetically controlled. There aren't enough genes there to do it. Really? He went on to say this wonderful diversity of the human species is not hardwired, genetically controlled, in our genetic code. Our environment is critical. What is he assuming here? He's assumed that fewer genes imply less genetic control of your behavior, right? He assumed that 100,000 genes, well, okay, we're genetically controlled because 100,000 genes would be enough, 75,000 genes wouldn't be quite enough, 50,000 wouldn't do it, and 30,000, it has to be environment. Really? Well, aren't 30,000 genes enough to explain human behavior? Let's take a look at the response to Venter. Do fewer genes equal greater free will? If that's the case, your local sponge, amoeba, and bacteria are the hallmark of free will because they're not encumbered by all those genes. See the fallacy of his initial assumption. Fewer genes equal more free will. Who's going to say that your local sponge gets up in the morning and goes, should I filter on the south side of the reef today or maybe the east side of the reef? Or how about that bacteria? I've been hanging out in that person's uvula for 2 days. I think I'll move down in the esophagus today, okay? Doesn't happen, right? There's no free will there, and there are very few genes. Great response was from Sir John Sulston, who came out and said, you know what? If we take 33 genes, just 33 genes, in just 2 varieties, for instance, gene on or gene off, how many different combinations could we get? Enough combinations with just 33 genes to make every living human being on the planet genetically distinct. That's with 33 genes. Do the math, right? Not 30,000 genes. He continues, there are 10 billion ways of flipping a coin 33 times? And I had to figure that out. I had to have my wife, the math teacher. How do you do that? Okay. Well, imagine the possible combinations with 30,000 genes, right? That's 2 times 2, 30,000 times. So she had to help the poor biologist work through the math there. But this is how it's done. I'm told by my math professor wife. This is how it's done. So you figure out if 33 genes alone can make every one of us genetically distinct from everyone else, are 30,000 enough? Oh, absolutely, unequivocally. Now, how do we approach this question? Now that we have a little history to the debate, how do we approach this question? This is a cautionary tale on where we decide whether our behavior is nurture, whether it's nature, whether it's free will. Stay with me for this cautionary tale. Bread consumption, health, and behavior. This is true data I'm going to give you here. 50% of all children who grow up in bread-eating households score below average on standardized achievement tests. That's true. And all the time we've known each other, have we ever lied to you? Look at his face. That's true. This is real data. This is true science. It gets better. Okay? More than 90% of violent crimes are committed within 24 hours of consuming bread. I almost rest my case, but there's more. More than 98% of convicted felons are bread users. And we also know that it's a gateway drug because it leads to harder things, peanut butter, strawberry jam. In the 18th century, when virtually all bread was cooked in the home, the average lifespan was less than 50 years. That's a bad omen for Panera, isn't it? Okay. And this is true. Most American bread consumers are unable to distinguish between significant scientific facts and meaningless statistical babble. Were we looking at causation or correlation? Hang that thought for a second. Let me give you another one. In the 1980s, it was determined that there was a correlation between the number of VCRs sold and the incidence of felony crime. It was true. I couldn't find the graph. I used to have this in another presentation. You look at the increase of VCR sales in the 1980s, it's almost parallel exactly with the increase in felonious crimes. Clearly showing what? Criminals own VCRs, or buying a VCR will make you a criminal. Not enough science for you there? Here you go, NPR. Sorry to say it. It's my bastion of salvation, but here we go. A study of 3,000 Europeans that were breastfed as babies determined that these individuals had an average IQ that was 6 points over those that were non-breastfed. So clearly, what does that mean? That breastfeeding makes you smarter, makes the baby smarter. Really? Okay, or there might be another explanation. What we don't want to do in addressing this question is confuse causation with correlation, because we're trying to figure out what's the causation of behavior, right? What's the correlation to environment? What's the correlation to genes and free will? Correlation is an apparent relationship between variables. Was there an apparent relationship between bread consumption and all those nasty events? Sure. I mean, the data's there. The data's there. But is there causation? Does eating bread make you a criminal? No. Does having a VCR make you want to go and rob the 7-Eleven store? No. Does being breastfed make you smarter? No. There are other explanations. So a cautionary tale is, let's watch to make sure that we're not confusing correlation between data with causation. Another cautionary tale besides that, what are the proximate and ultimate causes of behavior? What's the difference? Proximate causation. We say, what's the proximate causation of your behavior? What we mean here is either what's the immediate cause of your behavior? What's the immediate cause that made you do what you're doing? Or, why does that behavior occur? Let me give you an example. Here's our question. Why do birds breed in the spring in Michigan? What's the proximate cause of that? Well, increasing photoperiod, day length, causes, perceived by the pituitary, causes the pituitary gland in the brain to release hormones. Those hormones stimulate singing and mating. So we'd say the proximate cause of breeding in the spring is increased photoperiod, increased hormone production, making birds want to be nice in the back 40. Okay? That's the proximate causation. What's the ultimate causation? The ultimate causation is how does that behavior increase the fitness, the adaptability to the environment? So now the question is different, or the answer is different, right? Why do birds breed in the spring in Michigan? Same question, but different level of causality we're looking for. Because in spring, there's food abundance. Moderate temperatures and enough time to get the youngsters to fledge to become adults before the bad weather sets in. Right? So we look at what's the immediate cause, the proximate causation, versus what's the evolutionary reason that we behave that way. So when we're examining this topic tonight, let's look at make sure we're talking about ultimate versus proximate. Single variable or multivariate? Is it as simple as to say I behave this way because of the single variable? Or must we take in 2 variables, 3 variables, 4, 5? Wouldn't it be nice in science if everything was a single variable? Analytical perspective. Careful on where your bias is here. We always have to watch out for this in science. You try and come into this as least of a biased opinion as you possibly can. Let me give you an example. It's how we interpret the data. Happy homes produce happy children. Are we comfortable with that? I mean, is this earth-shaking philosophy? That's one way of looking at it. Or, do happy children produce happy homes? Children that are hugged a lot are happy. Right? It's our mantra as parents. Or, if we change our analytical perspective, do happy children get hugged a lot? Okay? How about beaten children become hostile? What's the other perspective? Hostile children get beaten. Children that get along with their parents don't do drugs. What's another perspective? Children that do drugs don't get along with their parents. 2 sides to every analytical coin. So let's be careful how we approach this as we do this. So our review, causation or correlation, proximate or ultimate causation, single variable or multivariate, and watch our analytical perspective as we now address the question. A quick look at behavior. Okay? Let's take a look at some different behavioral examples. And as we go through these different forms of behavior, in no way is this a treatise of all the forms of behavior, but they're relevant to the genome information. This is what I'm going to try and bring in, plus some other classics. We're going to look here at Harry Harlow. Harlow's monkeys. Many of you are familiar with, if you've gone through Psychology 101, you know about Harlow's monkeys. By the way, a little gee whiz fact. Harry Harlow's really name is Harry Israel, but this was done in 1930s. Was it good to have a Jewish-sounding name in the 1930s? His major professor said, you have no chance of getting an academic position with a name like Israel, so he changed it to Harry Harlow. And classic work he did with preference for mother types. Let's take a look. Here's his observation. University of Wisconsin, by the way, right over the pond. Monkeys raised in isolation, so this means without their mothers. So these monkeys were taken, these are rhesus monkeys, taken from their wild-born mothers, but taken early on and then raised in a sterile, clean, laboratory environment without any communication with other monkeys. They tend to cling tenaciously to scraps of cloth that was put in their cage, something for them to sleep on. And they grew up to be fearful, unhappy, and antisocial adults, if they didn't have mom around and they only had a rag. Monkeys that grew up with their mothers were normal, if we can establish what a normal monkey is, okay? But you can look at enough data and this works. So that's his observation. What was the conventional wisdom back there in 1930? Well, a child's love for his mother is because she is a source of nourishment. So what's that? Nature or nurture? You love your mother because genetically or because of environment? Does nobody love their mother in here? Okay, by this conventional wisdom here, why did these children grow up loving their mothers? Because they provided nourishment, right? It was a fostering environment, so way to go, Mom, I'll be a good kid. Here's his hypothesis. Baby monkeys are innately attracted to soft and comfortable mothers, and such comfort will result in well-rounded adults. A little local history. When you read his article on this, he came across this as he was flying from Detroit to Madison. He was flying over Lake Michigan, looking down at the clouds, and the clouds looked like big fluffy pillows, or the things that were in his monkey's cage. He's going, God, those are really beautiful. It's very soothing to see those clouds rather than the big lake I'm flying over. And he was soothed by that. He thought, well, maybe this is happening to my monkeys too. Maybe they find that cloth soothing. There's your hypothesis. What's your experiment? Took 8 rhesus monkeys. 4 of them he put into a cage that had, and the lighting is hard to see, but if we look over here, we have a wire mother. Yes, that is a wire mother. See the attractive eyes right here? Okay. That's a wire mother, but the key is that in 4 of the cages, it gave milk. There was a nipple that the baby could go up, cling onto this wire mother. Later on, by the way, they put really cool heads on them so that people visiting the lab would think it looked more like a mother. And so 4 of the wire mothers would give milk. The other 4, let me see, the other way around, I'm sorry, this is his first experiment. 1 is made of cloth and 1 of wire. In 4 cages, the wire mother gave milk, and the other 4, the cloth mother gave milk. You with me? Results. Monkeys with milk-providing cloth mothers clung to them. So you're in a cage that has a mom that's made out of cloth, and she produces milk. Are you a happy camper? Oh, you are. Okay. Those with milk-providing wire mothers clung to the cloth mothers, even though no milk. Those with milk, I think of wire mothers, clung to the cloth mothers, even though no milk was provided. So now you have in your cage a cloth mom, but she's not giving milk. Right on the other side of the cage, you might have a wire mom who does give milk, but who are you going to hang on to? The wire milk-producing mom or the cloth non-producing mom? Cloth non-producing. And what he found out, in fact, there's a classic photograph from Harlow's lab of a baby rhesus monkey that reaching on, he's on the cloth mother, and he's reaching across as far as he can to the wire mother to get the milk, but not letting go of the cloth mother. And all the monkeys did this. What's the conclusion? There's an innate, insert here, genetic. There's a genetic preference for soft and tactile mothers, and this is essential for normal development. Okay? A very clever experiment that shows that this happens to be innate. Now you say, well, is that enough information? Well, we can go further. So we have an epilogue here, and we'll see one of his students follow this up. Experimenters repeated this, other researchers repeated this, not just wire versus cloth moms. They did warm versus chilled moms. Where did the baby monkeys go? The warm moms. Those that didn't have access to warm moms grew up as wacko monkeys. Okay? Rocking versus stationary moms. There were little mechanical moms that went back and forth. Who did the babies go for? Rocking moms. Those who didn't have rocking moms grew up wacko. Okay? Harlow presents his paper, The Nature of Love. That's a hook, isn't it? Okay, the keynote address at the American Psychological Association in 1958. And in this, his thesis is that man cannot live by milk alone, right? So conventional wisdom, gone. It's more than just mom, thanks for the nutrition. I want a nice, comfortable mom. I want a rocking mom. And that produces a behavior considered normal. Pavlov's dogs, learned behavior continued. Okay? Pavlov's dogs, we know about Pavlov and what he did. Actually, interesting, the story is always told to our 101 students that Pavlov very cleverly produced this experiment where, of course, he rang bells and the dogs salivated because they were anticipating being fed. In reality, he discovered this because every time his crew would come into the lab to feed the dogs, they were wearing white lab coats. The initial release was white lab coats. He goes, well, let's make this a little cleaner. Okay? So that's how he noticed it, and then he introduced the bell. So what do? We ring a bell, we feed you. We ring a bell, you feed you. You come to be conditioned to the fact that when the bell is ringed, you're going to get fed. So pretty soon, we eliminate feeding you. We ring the bell, and what are you going to do? Salivate, right? Don't you do that in the mall at Mrs. Field's Cookies? I mean, you're 25 stores away, and you smell that, and all the way going, I can't wait to get there, right? You've conditioned yourself. Classic experiment. We've continued this now with knowledge of the genome. Now, let's bring in genome here and your friend, the fruit fly. Fruit flies can actually be taught to learn, believe it or not. You put them in a little flask, and you have a little landing pad for them, and you introduce an odor. When you introduce the odor, you shock them. Okay? Which, when you have 6 legs, is a real bummer. Okay? So you're sitting there all of a sudden, that smells good, and so what happens? And of course, boom, they get into flight. So you can then condition them to recognize that when you smell the odor, you're going to get shocked. So what did the smart fruit flies do? They took off, right? They would start flying. As soon as the odor would come in, they'd go, no way, I'm not sitting down there, and they would fly. It shows wonderful conditioning, very Pavlovian conditioning, learned behavior. But intergenome. Learning can only take place if all 17, what we're now at this point very euphemistically going to call the learning genes, called the Krebs genes, are present. By the way, these same learning genes, the same 17, are found in all animals, whether you're a human or whether you're a fruit fly. If one of the genes is missing, did the fruit flies get off the bottom? No, they got chalked over and over. Okay, wow. And then we realized they're missing some of these genes. So the conditioned behavior only works if you have the gene. So the learning can only be accomplished if the genetic basis to accept the learning is there. So nature or nurture or all of the above. Krebs genes do really cool things. Learning genes, they turn on during the learning experience and establish new connections between neurons, which are nerve cells. And this lighting, it's a little difficult to see, but the big guys right here happen to be our neurons. And look at these little connections going between them. That's what the Krebs genes do. They say, hey, reach over there and connect to that other neuron. The basis of learning is a change in the anatomy of your brain, establishing more connections. I won't have you do it, but assume that you're all neurons in here, okay? If you hold his hand, and you hold his hand, and you hold his hand, boom, you just made a memory in more ways than one, okay? Because I saw him come out of the bathroom and he didn't wash, okay? But what happens now if you go up behind you and you hold the hands and back, you've made yet other connections. This is how your brain works, but those connections can't be made if the Krebs genes aren't there. Without learning behavior, our genes will not turn on to make new neural connections. So environment is important to elicit the response of the genes to change the anatomy for learning. And Krebs genes are more active what? When we're younger or older? Yeah, how many people enroll in French classes when they're 60? Who wants to learn the guitar at 45? I'm still trying. I can do March of the Gnomes and that's about it. I should have done it when I was 10, okay, when my Krebs genes were still firing. Therefore, memory is stored via nurture under the influence is stored via nature under the influence of nurture. It's the genes that allow you to actually permanentize that memory, but you have to have the environment to initiate it. Genes may function under the influence of nurture. That's a whole new way of looking at genes and how they operate. Let's take a look at Lorenz and Spalding for a second. They introduced this concept called imprinting period, that critical window of time when a learned behavior can be accommodated, when behaviors can be learned, but the window closes. We know this is true in birds. It's a bunch of different animals. And I just made reference to that in human learning. We know that kids learn languages before year 8 or 9 much faster than after that. The window doesn't completely close, but there's a vast body of research to show in birds especially, if the birds aren't exposed to their species-specific song by a certain time, they'll never learn it, even if they're exposed to it afterwards. The same is true, by the way, with language in humans. Goslings less than 15 hours old or more than 3 days old would not imprint. Once imprinted, it was permanent. If you've ever raised ducks, you know how this works, right? So if the goslings rather hatch out, if they're less than 15 hours old, they just kind of look at you and they're not going to imprint upon you. But that window, 15 hours to 3 days, the first animate object that comes by, be it lawnmower, be it person or dog, that's mom. Which is why I lost many, many ducklings as a kid growing up, Easter ducks. My mom would be out there hanging up the laundry, and she was mom, and she'd do a reverse without the reverse lights, and one less duck. Okay, because that was mom. They were there during the imprinting period. So Lorenz showed, along with Spalding, that there was a genetically determined imprinting period, but an imprinting would not occur, however, though, without the environment triggering. So if you take those goslings, keep them away from any animate objects during that first several hours to 3 days, and then you introduce a dog, even mom, will they imprint on it? No, the window's closed. Behavior influences the gene's expression. Therefore, behavior was a result of nature via nurture. Let's take a look at a student, another one of Harlow's students of one of Harlow's graduate students, Susan Minica, who was at University of Wisconsin when she did this work. Now she's at Northwestern, I believe. She made an observation that was well known, by the way. It wasn't her original observation. Wild-reared monkeys are afraid of snakes, while lab-raised monkeys show no fear. So if we raise rhesus monkeys in captivity, never contact with another monkey and say, here, have a pet boa. Okay? They'll reach over it to get food. It's no big deal. Try that with a wild-reared monkey, and it just has conniption fits inside the cage. So that was known. What's our hypothesis? Fear of snakes must be acquired vicariously by observing the reaction of other monkeys. How do you test that hypothesis? Experiment number 1. Expose lab-reared monkeys to snakes. Experiment number 2. Expose lab-reared monkeys to snakes in the presence of their experienced wild-reared moms. You can probably anticipate what's going to happen here. Results. Laboratory-reared monkeys exposed to snakes while apart from their wild-reared mothers showed no fear. They go, okay, a snake, get out of the way, there's my kibble. I mean, they were sometimes seen not only just stepping over it, but actually picking it up and moving them if the snake went into the food bowl. Okay, that's monkey bravado. Okay? On the second experiment, when the mother is introduced to the cage with her child, a mother that was raised in the wild, a mother that had experience with snakes, she reacts so violently to the snakes that guess what the kid does immediately? Reacts in the same manner. And every time after that event, even though mom's not around, the child will react the same way. And even with plastic snakes. Conclusion. A monkey's fear of snakes must be learned by example. But she doesn't stop there. Observation number 2. This fear of snakes was acquired immediately and did not require subsequent reinforcement. Many things we learn, guitar playing, a lot of things, right, is that, you know, gee, I should watch out for pit bulls. I forgot. It's been 15 years. I thought they were nice now, okay? But some things require reinforcement, right? But this didn't. It happened immediately. There was no learning curve, and it never faded in those animals. Hypothesis. Not all fears are learned with the same ease. Well, duh. Anybody who's tried to learn physics versus underwater soap carving versus English knows that they have differential levels of difficulty in trying to acquire those. That's her hypothesis. How do you test it? This is cool. Videos just came out when she was doing this. It was a pioneering technology in those halcyon days of the 70s, okay? Videos shown to naive monkeys, a monkey raised in captivity. The video was shown of a monkey reacting violently to snakes but not to flowers, okay? So we have a naive monkey. We're going to show him a video. And the video is the monkey reacting to snakes and not to flowers. Let's see what happens. Okay, video shown to naive monkeys of a monkey reacting violently to snakes but not to flowers, and then monkeys reacting violently to flowers but not to snakes. And it was doctored, of course. You can't, you know, just have a scary flower, okay? So that was, well, you can, okay? But so this were doctored, okay? So, and we knew that they responded based upon some preliminary investigations. So you have it? You have it now? We have monkey watching video of mom wigging out with the snake but not worrying about the flower. Then we have monkeys watching a doctored videotape of mom nonchalantly not worrying about the snake, but wigging out about the flower. What happened? Monkeys shown the videos of other monkeys reacting to snakes learned a fear of snakes, but not of flowers. You didn't even need the real mom. Just watching the video once was enough to immediately establish that fear of snakes, and it lasted forever. Let's check out flower power. Monkeys shown videos of other monkeys reacting to flowers and not to snakes did not develop a fear of flowers or snakes. So I'm a monkey watching this video of another monkey going, oh my God, a flower, oh my God, a flower, cool snake, oh my God, a flower. Didn't develop the fear of flowers, nor did it develop the fear of snakes. Conclusion. Some behaviors are easier to learn than others. We've been there. Therefore, some behaviors are genetically coded for ease of learning. The fear of snakes, the ability to acquire that fear, was genetically programmed. But the acquisition of that fear required nurture. So, is the fear of snakes and monkeys nature or nurture or both? We're not even going to introduce free will of monkeys here, okay? Let's hang loose on free will, okay? We'll be here all night, okay? What was the proximate cause of the fear of snakes? Okay, well, the proximate fear of snakes was watching another monkey react to it. What's the ultimate causation? What's the evolutionary benefit of the reaction? Not getting bitten by a poisonous snake. Right? So we look at two levels of behavior. Now, the question we ask, do humans show prepared learning? Are we afraid of snakes? Yeah, especially when that size. Look at that thing. I was in my backyard in California, man. We lost several neighborhood children. A couple I was afraid to lose, ashamed to lose, the other two. Okay, but look at this. What are our most commonly cited phobias? Snakes, right? Thunder, spiders, dark, heights, deep water, small spaces. See, you're moving in your chairs. You're going, oh, God. Okay. How about snakes while I'm in a cave with thunder outside and a spider going across my head and there's a deep well in there? Then you're just a basket case, okay? So we can get all your phobias at once. Now you say, well, do these phobias make sense in an evolutionary context? Let's take you from condo to cave. Right? Let's get you out of your condominium and go back to the cave. Does it make sense way back when, before we knew about snakes, to have a fear of them? Sure, because Grandpa didn't have a fear of him. He liked to go up and hug him. Okay? Okay? Well, we shouldn't use Grandpa. Let's use your son, okay? Your son likes to go up and hug snakes. Is your son going to live long enough to pass on that love of snakes? No. How about going out and going, rhino hunting in a lightning storm? Did Thor survive long enough to pass on that? No. So those other behaviors didn't last long enough. So did it make sense in a cave person sense to have those fears? Sure, it did. Why don't we fear other things that make more sense? Okay? Riding in cars. Folks, last year, 39,200 people died in the United States in train crashes. How many people died from lightning or spiders or deep water? Which is the rational fear? Riding in cars. How about downhill skiing? Boy, my mantra in life, it's a fine line between bravery and stupidity. Okay? Some of these things go way over the line, okay, of that. Smoking, alcohol, electrical sockets. Right? These are more rational fears, but do you fear them the same way you fear tight spaces? No. So why is that? Well, Matt Ridley checks in on this. Says it defies common sense not to see the handiwork of evolution here. The human brain is pre-wired, innate, to learn fears that were of relevance in the Stone Age. Genes are parts of an information system that collects facts about the world in the past and incorporates them into a good design for the future through natural selection. Why are you easily influenced by your mother or father going, oh my God, a snake? You're pre-wired to accept that fear. Just like Susan Menike's monkeys are pre-wired to accept the fear of snakes, but not of flowers. Let's take a look now at what Susan Menike then called prepared learning. This is what we've been discussing. You're prepared to learn things faster, some things faster than others. It's almost the opposite of imprinting with Lorenz. Imprinting is automatic and irreversible. Wide variety of targets will elicit the response. It could be you, the dog, the cat, the lawnmower, that can be the surrogate mom. But in prepared learning, Siegelman and Menike, said prepared learning, or the learning ability, varies with the type of stimulus. Behavior responds to a narrow range of targets. It's almost the opposite. How do we count then for things like stereotypical behavior, like in males? Okay? In all species, what are the characteristics of male? If you had to go through the job description for a male, we are now hiring males. Here's your job description. More risk-taking than females, increased aggression and violence, polygynous tendencies, multiple mates, premature mortality due to homicides, suicides, accidents, heart disease. This is true. You look at the data, it's there. This is that job description for what makes male male. I personally, representing that half of the species, would like to redo this job description and look at it from a different perspective, where males in the world that we recognize are highly sensitive to feelings. Their commitment to long-term relationships, always the first to admit an error, okay? Always willing to engage in meaningful dialogue, desire to put the toilet seat down, and a desire to cuddle, okay? I think that's more accurate, okay? But we'll go with the party line and take a look at that other definition of what makes male male. Okay. Let's take a look at the genome. What's that maleness that we talked about? There's a gene called the SRY gene that at week 6 in human development turns on. It causes the production of testosterone, which changes the generic reproductive tract in a human embryo into male. In the absence of this gene turning on, what's the default sex in humans? It's female. If this gene doesn't turn on, the default sex is female. The reproductive tract will then develop into a female. It's the SRY gene on that Y chromosome that directs the formation of testosterone and later masculinizes the embryo, including the production of the reproductive tract. At puberty, testicles produce more testosterone, and then you get these things called secondary sexual characteristics, what we think of as maleness, right? It's that larger body mass, the deeper voice, the body hair, the sensitivity, the caring, the cuddle factor, and all the others that we've talked about. Okay? And you can induce these by injecting testosterone. So it's the function of that SRY gene that does this. Now, how do we account for that behavior? Why would something like that evolve? Is that behavior always environmental? Do males behave this way because it's the environment that tells you to behave this way? That behavior is very stereotypical through almost all cultures. Look at the Yanomamo, found in northern Amazonia. As male Yanomamos kill more men in their community, they wind up more successful at breeding. And it's not because they're killing the competition. I mean, there are plenty of females to go around, but the more men you have killed, the sexier you are. Nature or nurture? Well, doesn't killing your conspecific, a member of your own species, go against evolutionary theory? I mean, is it wise to decrease the size of your gene pool? Doesn't that decrease your ability of your gene pool to adapt to changing environments? Seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? Or is it? Ladies, not you, but you probably have a friend who has a neighbor who has a gardener who once dated somebody who knew somebody who had two guys fight over her. Stop it in 20 minutes. Stop it in 20 minutes. Who are you going to date, the loser or the winner? You know the answer. Why? Okay, ladies, I mentioned this in one of my previous presentations. Here you go. Ladies, you have to go home tonight with a guy. Okay? And here's your choice. You have a guy who has you don't know anything about him. You don't know, they're both the same age. Okay? Both same physical condition, but one of them drives a brand new Ferrari, paper plates. The other one's driving an 82 Geo. That's all you know. Quick. Who are you going to go home with? Well, the Ferrari, I hope. How come? Is he more likely to provide the resources that you and your children need for survival? You go, well, maybe the guy driving the Geo is really a millionaire and he's trying to get in touch with his roots. Yeah, you run with that. Okay? So is that male behavior an artifact of environment, or is it genes? We look, information from the genome says there's a phenomenally strong genetic influence. Does that mean, though, guys, that we're all going to be murderers and we're all going to be social deviants and that we're all going to have these problems? Well, no, it doesn't, right? Let's look at the gray area between nature and nurture, then. Sickle cell anemia, which is not a behavior, I understand. Sickle cell anemia is a disease caused, of course, in the red blood cells here, where they get a sickle shape, and that doesn't allow them to go through the capillary beds like normal blood cells do. They cause a traffic jam, resulting in downstream stoppage of blood flow, death of the tissues, and eventually, unfortunately, death of the individual. This is caused because of one little mutation in an amino acid. There is no environmental influence here whatsoever. There's environmental benefit of having that, but there's no influence causing the condition. Straightforward. Let's look at PKU. Nasty disease. Phenylketonuria causes mental retardation because an amino acid called phenylalanine can't be broken down by the individual. So if you have phenylalanine in your diet, it winds up with severe mental retardation. Okay, because there happens to be an error in the metabolism that can't break that down. There's a genetic cause you can't break down that amino acid. So that begs the question then, what causes PKU? That mutation that doesn't produce the enzyme to break down the amino acid. But you know what? If you have a diet that include phenylalanine will induce PKU. How about if we give you a diet that doesn't have phenylalanine? And this is how we treat it nowadays. You know, when the infant's born and we take the little blood sample, one of the things we test for by law in Michigan is PKU. If the kid is positive for that trait, we say we have to reduce as much as possible this amino acid from your child's diet. In the absence of that amino acid, they grow up perfectly normal. So, is PKU a genetic condition because they lack a properly functioning gene? or is it environmental because it's the diet that induces the condition? Remember, analytical perspective. Okay, one of the last ones I have for you here, another great study here. This is important in recognition of grammar ability, which I'm not having right now. FOXP2 gene is on chromosome number 7. Has to be present in the correct form in order for normal speech and even grammar recognition to occur. So we now know this, that FOXP2 gene has to be there in order for you to develop proper speech and even recognition of syntax grammar. FOXP2 is found in all mammals once again, but it's unique in humans. In fact, one amino acid out of 715 is different than us than all primates. Could that be the reason that we've developed the ability? Could be. However, language still has to be learned during that critical period. Having the gene is not enough. Remember the movie Nell? Okay? Kind of the same thing, okay? Is that if you're raised apart from that reinforcement, you're not going to be able to develop that. So having the FOXP2 gene is fine, but you still have to be introduced. So what's your ability to speak? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Okay, the last one here. Whoops. Let me hit a reverse here. Let me just go back one. This is a study done in, done in New Zealand from Terry Moffat. Wonderful study here where they had an observation. Her observation was that boys from abusive families tend to grow up to be violent and antisocial. Probably doesn't surprise many people in the room. Her hypothesis, maltreatment alters personality in boys. Is that the nature or the nurture camp there? That's the nurture view, right? You're going to become antisocial if you have an antisocial environment in which you grow up. Here's the experiment, really cool. They went to New Zealand. They took 442 boys that were born between 1972 and 1973 and done it in New Zealand. They all were as close to being the same in environment as they could. They all had 4 white grandparents, little variation in class, wealth, and I've been to this town. It's just your basic farm community. Okay? They tracked them all the way into adulthood. When they started tracking these boys, 8% of them were considered to have been severely maltreated between their 3rd and 11th year of growing up. 28% probably were maltreated during the same period. The rest were treated normally. That's the experiment. What are the results? Many, but not all, of the maltreated boys turned into violent, antisocial adults that maltreated others. So many, but not all, of the maltreated. What's the hypothesis? Well, is there a genetic link then interacting with the environment to produce this behavior? God, how would you test that? Let's take a look. They tested for the activity level of a gene that unfortunately in the popular press has become known as the violence gene. First of all, remember there's no single gene for anything probably. It's a cadre of influences, but let's call it the violence gene for a second, which is a gene called monoamine oxidase, MAOA. It's been linked to aggressive behavior before. So they thought, well, wait, let's see if these boys that wound up to be aggressive, violent men, let's take a look at their gene and see what condition it's in. Let's look at its relationship to the observed behavior. The results? Those boys that had really highly active MAOA genes showed no significant behavior changes due to maltreatment. Okay, so if you have this gene and it's highly active, producing the enzymes that it does, even if you're maltreated, chances are you're not going to grow up to be abnormal, even if you're maltreated. Results 2. Those boys that had low activity in MAO genes showed 4 times the level of antisocial behavior if they were maltreated. So if you have the low active version of the gene and you're maltreated, you have 4 times the chance of being aggressive, involved in rapes, etc. What's the conclusion? Conclusion number 1, it's not enough to be maltreated. You must also have the low active MAO gene. Conclusion 2, it's not enough to have the low active MAO gene, you must also be maltreated. Conclusion 3, having a bad genotype is not a behavioral mandate. You must also have an abusive environment. Cliff Notes version, if you have the gene that's low active and you're abused, you have 4 times the chance of being abusive as you grow up. If you have the low active gene and you're not abused, then you're not going to have any increased potential. But if you have the low active gene and you've been abused, 4 times the chance of being abusive as an adult. What are the ramifications? Think about this. What happens if we find a child who was left too long in a household that was abusive? We rescue him from that environment. We find out that he has the low active MAOA gene. What's his potential for becoming abusive as an adult? It's almost certain, isn't it? What do we do in that situation? How would you like to be the child who just found that out? That you have 4 times the chance of being a rapist, or 4 times the chance of being a murderer. What do we do as a society when we find that out? What does the person do? Is this the day when I go off the deep end? I was abused and I have the low active gene. Think of the ramifications of that. The genome is amazing, but we also have some very serious social questions. Weighing in now towards the end here, the free will conundrum. We forgot about the philosophers. We have to bring back free will. Let's take a look here at William James. Great quote. At the beginning of his treatment on this topic of free will, I thus disclaim, pardon the old English here, I disclaim openly to the threshold all pretension to prove to you that the freedom of the will is true. The most I hope to induce some of you is to follow my example in assuming it's true. Wow, that's a data-ridden sentence there, isn't it? Basically, let's assume it's true and let's all believe it's true. That was kind of that cannonball across the bow there to get this going on. Other philosophers weigh in and say, well, you know, free will is neither an impossibility or an illusion. Free will is a real thing. If science shows a genetic basis for a behavior, does this reduce or eliminate the concept of free will? So what we know now from my examples and genome, we now know that there's a strong genetic influence. Does that mean that the free will is gone? If behavior is a result of free will, then is it not random? Because if behavior is a result of free will, your will to do a behavior means it's not completely random. You've evaluated your action before you took the behavior. Well, if it's not random, it must have a cause and therefore not free. Remember at Philosophy 101, at the end of the day, you went, huh? Okay. So kind of a cyclical argument there. Let's take a look at Spinoza. I love this. Okay. The only difference between a human and a stone rolling down a hill is that the human thinks that he is in charge of his own destiny. A little extreme there, okay? Are you confused yet? Let's take a look at Hume. Either our actions are determined, in which case there is nothing that we can do about them, or our actions are random, in which case there is nothing that we can do about them. I'm not sure. Okay? So in summary, what do we have here? Nature and nurture are not mutually exclusive. They interact at some level. It's not nature versus nurture, as Galton proposed. It's nature via nurture, at least in some cases. Genes are conditional, and they're really, really good for you computer folks at if-then statements, right? If this event happens in the environment, then have this manifestation. An example, all of you have the gene to produce melanin, right, to get a tan. Are you going to spontaneously tan tonight? No, not unless you have the environmental stimulus of ultraviolet light to turn that gene on. If there is UV light, then produce melanin. If you're raised in a fatherless household, data clearly shows that young girls menstruate early. Menarche is up to 2 to 3 years earlier if you're raised in a fatherless household. If there is a dominant male absent, then menstruate earlier. And the sociologists can run with that for 10 hours. Okay? The more that we understand our genes and our instincts, less inevitable they seem. Just because you have the gene, the low active MAO gene, does that mean that you're going to be abusive? No. If we understand it, we now try and interact with it. So, nature and nurture, how do genes interact? I said that what we were going to do here at the end is ask you to reevaluate where we've been. Would you now modify your initial nexus of influence for nature, nurture, and free will? Are you going to be on the left-hand graph, where you're confident that it's just nature and nurture? Or are we going to move over to the right-hand side with Spinoza and the rest of the folks and say, well, it's free will in there also. So my free will controls my nature and my nurture. Or something else we can discuss here, is free will just nature and or nurture, directed behavior masquerading as free will? Does natural selection select for kind, considerate, sensitive, gentle, compassionate males that are faithful? And is that environment doing that, or is it genes? Do genes control our behavior and our destiny? What are the social ramifications of knowing a person's genetic predisposition to antisocial behavior? Thank you for listening. Jeff, can we get some lights up? Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, Ray.
Basically, when we look at like instincts, what's hardwired now, we have to understand that that is imprinted on the genes by nurture, by the environment over the history of our species, and even before that. And you got into that without actually stating that explicitly. One brief comment as far as behavioral plasticity. I remember I lived in a place a few years ago that had chipmunks there that would, for instance, be a wild cat around. The chipmunk would go on top of a rock or climb a tree, watch me chase the cat out. Once the cat was gone, it would go and get food. And I could sit up with my cat sitting right next to me, a chipmunk would actually run over the cat to get to the food I had for him. So, as far as adapting to the environment, you're hardwired for these things. And also, my Ferrari is coming in on Friday.
Yeah. There you go. Excellent.
Who's next?
I think you do have to watch out for the Lamarckian interpretation with respect to what was just discussed, because the environment's not causing the mutations, the environment's causing the selection. We sometimes talk about genes being the victim of the environment, being the victim of selection, in terms of whether or not they get multiplied.
Thank you.
In the study you were discussing regarding the boys who were maltreated, what was the percentage, or were there those who had neither of those indicators that then became violent?
Yeah, still the question is, I think if everybody heard it on that New Zealand study, do you have boys who had the highly active gene, which means you weren't predisposed to antisocial behavior, who also became antisocial? Yes, because it's not strictly genetic, right? There's going to be an environmental influence. I don't remember the numbers right now. I did read the original study. It was a small percentage. It wasn't statistically significant. So yes, certainly there's going to be some environmental influence in there.
Keith?
Yeah, I was asking about the snake. When they showed the monkey the snake, was it a picture of a snake or was it a real snake that was moving? And because I'm wondering if maybe the fact that the motion had something to do with the fact that it
Right.
initiated fear.
Right, because what you're looking at, what's the actual releaser? What's the sign stimulus? Is it the shape of the snake, or is it the movement of the snake? The answer to that is it didn't matter, because the experiments were done with live snakes, and then remember in one of my slides it said it didn't matter if it was even a plastic snake. It got to the point where just once they had actually learned the behavior, it could be triggered by anything remotely resembling that releaser. And it had to be taught, though, by the mother responding. So the mother could respond to a plastic snake, the mother could respond to a video snake, but as long as she responded, that behavior was elicited in the offspring immediately, and from that point on out, even if it never saw mom again.
Well, what I was thinking is if the flower had been moving, maybe they would have been afraid of the flower because they weren't. Like just still.
It's been a while since I've read that. I don't remember if they did that or not. Moving flowers are scary. Could be. That's something you need to look at, though, right? Something you need to look at. But you don't see that in the wild, though. Of course, they're not conditioned for that release from the wild. So, I don't know. Let me get back to you. Let you know.
But what if the monkey was like the one that was contained, if it was first bitten? I mean, would he have learned not to mess with snakes?
Okay. Question is, what happens if you're not afraid of snakes, and if, in fact, then you're bitten after that? The question would be is, what kind of snake is biting you? If it's lethal, you don't get a chance to learn from that experience, right? So if you have a non-lethal, the monkeys did develop that, okay? So once again, it wasn't strictly innate. It wasn't strictly genetic. They had the ability to still learn by experience, if you lived long enough to do that. Thor has to recognize that you shouldn't walk in the tar pit. If Thor walks in the tar pit, Thor doesn't get a chance to correct that behavior.
Dr. Barr?
That wasn't in one of Lawrence's words where he said that birds inherently were afraid of snakes and also of black objects and hands.
Yeah, you saw that. That was Nico and Tinbergen who did some of that classic work there. You didn't even have to have the identity of the snake. It's as easy as the silhouette of the. And for instance, the classic work by Tinbergen and Nico and Tinbergen was that you take imagine this in your mind what a silhouette of a Canada goose looks like. If you flew it over the cage of captive quail in the direction that a goose flies with the longer neck, okay, they didn't have the escape response. If you ran it over the cage in the opposite direction in your mind, and now it looks like a hawk, then they had the response. So they didn't have to have any coloration. It was just the shape. It wasn't the direction, but that was all they needed for the releaser. So different species respond to different releasers. There are things called supernormal releasers. This is what we do in advertising, right? What color car does Dodge always try and sell you? Every Dodge commercial, what color is it? It's red, right? They don't, I mean, it's like white. When's the last time you went to a store window and they have the white shirt on the mannequin going, buy this white shirt, right? Because we know that colors elicit that response, and some of them are supernormal releasers.
Do you know if they attempted to precondition any of the monkeys? In other words, show one snakes, let it be around snakes for a while, and then see if it the mother freak out and the tail.
So to be caged with friendly snakes to lose that fear?
Yeah, if they would not learn it, if they'd already been exposed to snakes and didn't recognize them as any.
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know that was covered in there. Dr. Bajma, do you know? I don't recall. It's,
Karen?
I have a similar question relative to those boys. If
Mhm.
they follow up at all to study to see once the gene's been activated because they had the low acting gene and then they were abused and then they became abusive.
mm-hmm.
Did they further study to find out if they could turn off that gene then, or is it like irreversible and they're just doomed?
Yeah, we don't know how to modify genes yet very well. We can turn on and turn off genes, but that's difficult to do in an organism complicated as a human, ethically also. So we do not have the ability to turn those genes on and off yet. So that wouldn't be.
They can't, the behavior modification of like the field of psychology, right? They can't like unlearn this behavior.
Well, sure you can. Sure, and this is why we said, think of the paradox now. I'm a 12-year-old child. I've been rescued too late from an abusive home. I go to counseling, and they happen to check for the MAOA gene, and they find out that I have the low-active gene. Man, I'm a disaster possibly waiting to happen. So what does society do? We say, well, just go away, we can't do anything. That's not a viable alternative because we kind of know what the fate's going to be. So what do we try and do? We bring in the psychological counseling community to try and then override that genetic basis for the behavior. Yeah, we don't just cast him at the wolves. So, and that's what psychology is very effective at in some situations.
Yes.
Yes, you just brought it up and answered the one question, because if that, if you left them there, then that's a fear and it's never going to be worked out. But of course, you help them develop so that they don't have to get to that point.
You try to help them develop so they can get to that point, right? But you see things that we talked about, the gene for production of testosterone. I mean, those of you who are sporting testosterone, it's a very powerful hormone. It controls, so we say that, and this is, of course, what do we do with serial sex offenders? You have chemical castration or physical castration. How come? We need to stop the production of that the testosterone from the SRY gene because it's a very, very powerful motivator of behavior. So we can't turn the gene off, but we can block the action of the testosterone. So we can tell you this is bad. We can tell you this is wrong. You can recognize that and understand and believe that, but can you control the hormonal influence in your behavior? We find that for many individuals, no, they can't.
Bob?
I don't know which slide it was on, but it mentioned Martin Seligman down at the bottom, who's
Mhm.
also past president of APA.
Mhm.
And he did a lot
Was
of
Harlow's student, I believe, who was Minica's student.
yeah.
So it's the boom, boom, boom. All University of Wisconsin.
He did a lot of research on avoidance and escape conditioning and how to treat it, how to reverse those conditions as well.
That's a very powerful lab. If you go to University of Wisconsin, just put in Harlow, University of Wisconsin, you get to their website. Powerhouse of researchers, powerhouse on this particular field. So it's a good place to start.
Yep.
going back to this longitudinal study with the boys,
Mm-hmm.
since it was controlled, you had a control group and so forth, with those that were identified with the problems and the cause
Mhm.
determined, was there any follow-up by other disciplines, such as psychologists and so forth, to see if they could alter that, or did they just let it?
What wasn't covered in the original study that I read at that point. Okay, so I don't know if there were other studies after that. Don't know.
Wasn't it a recent study?
What's that?
Wasn't it a fairly recent study?
I think it's 90. It's 2000. It's 2000. 2000 with the publication. 2000.
Any kind of therapy and report on it.
2001. I'm sorry. It's a 2001 paper. 2001 paper.
Recent.
Right. Opportunities for you psychologists here. 2001.
Catherine?
I was wondering on this reversal of behavior. They're saying that high percentage of people who are in prison are going to return. And also, the thing that it brings up is several years ago, they released a lot of the mental patients into society and the communities.
Mhm.
Have there been any studies on those kind of things in the environment and whether it's permanent to the psyche?
I'm a lowly biologist, so I will defer to Dr. Collins. Do you know of any?
We know that a lot of them wind up back in jail, or they wind up with alternative community-based intervention, but and the new medications are making a difference. The new medications probably help to release these patients from hospitals. I see society as having the major problem in handling these people. If we had the resources and such, we would probably find ways to help them to stay off the streets.
And because this is what we're looking at here is nature via nurture, controlling the expression of the genes, in this case, lack of neurotransmitter production by intervention with the environment. Chester.
I have a question regarding gene therapy.
Mhm.
My understanding of genes, which is very, very small, is that when you inherit your genes, you are then built from those. But I'm coming to realize that, in fact, after you're built, in fact, your genes that you then hold, in other words, it's not like you have a gene that might cause a gland in your brain to release some sort of hormone, which may make you violent. I thought that was the extent of genes, but with gene therapy, they're actually going into people and changing the gene. So in other words, genes actually have an effect on your on you and your behaviors after the fact, after you're built. Is that true?
If I understand your question, can we modify those genes and therefore your behavior postpartum?
Well, okay, I guess what I'm saying is that my understanding was that you were built from your genes, and so then once something is built, it acts the way it is. But with gene therapy, they're going in and changing, changing or turning on or off a gene, and it then affects you?
It could. We're not doing that with behavior. You have to understand that we've had the ability since the early 80s to produce new sequences of DNA in machinery that looks a lot like today's label maker machine. I mean, you can literally punch in the nucleotide sequence you want, and it comes out. Okay, so we can make DNA. It's biology 501. Okay, here's the ringer. It's small. Okay, how do you get a DNA strand open to go and put in the new gene? Have we been able to do that? We can't take tiny scissors and go ahead and open up and spread it. So in gene therapy, we're very, very limited because we can make the correct sequence, quote unquote, of DNA. But how do we get it spliced in? And that's not going into one cell, remember, it's going into all of the affected cells. So we have a mechanical problem here. We've only been successful in very limited events. For instance, cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a gene error, and the gene produces large quantities of very thick mucus, makes it hard to clean mucus, thermoregulate, etc. We've identified, of course, where that gene is. We know how to correct it for the proper gene sequence, but how do you get it in to every cell lining your lungs? Clever. We have it spliced into viruses. The viruses, we splice it into the genome of viruses, which are pathogenic viruses that we turn off their pathogenic genes. You put it in an inhaler. The viruses then go into the lining of the lungs, and as you know about viruses, they actually inject literally their DNA or their RNA. They're injecting in the virus they're using, I think, is a DNA virus, and then what's in there? The corrected version of the gene. We thought, well, so they inject it in the cell. Why is it going to be incorporated into our DNA, let alone on the correct chromosome, let alone in the correct portion of the chromosome, let alone override the mutant gene? Ha! It worked. Go figure. Okay? And so, that's used clinically now. But that's because we had access to the cells with an inhaler. So every couple of weeks, when you get a new crop of cells, you do it. How do you do that with your brain? So we have a mechanical problem.
Yeah, I actually have a couple of comments. One is, I think that with the paired learnness that Seligman and his colleagues discussed, one thing that has to be considered is looking at it in terms of a genetic predisposition, but again, emphasizing the environmental influence of it, particularly with the phobias, in terms of understanding how some people end up developing phobias to snakes where others don't, and also in terms of some of the treatments that Bob spoke about in terms of treating people for phobias and being successful at that. So I've taken people who have had rat phobias, and within 3 hours I can get them to pick up a rat and hold the rat for 3 minutes with no problems and report reduced anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So I think emphasizing that, and also again with some of the testosterone literature, even that's from the research that I've read is somewhat on the fence in terms of looking at kind of more hormonal influences and its relation to aggressive behavior versus other kinds of more environmental influences that also impact aggressive behavior. I mean, even with the sex offenders, with the chemical castration, they've been using that now fairly regularly to treat sex offenders, but still find that there's a number of sex offenders who, even after you've chemically castrated, continue to be assaultive. It's just that they're not using their biological
Right.
body parts to actually engage in the sexual sexual assault. They're using kind of other objects and that sort of thing. So.
Well, thank you for both those comments. And it emphasizes kind of our theme here is that the gene may not be enough. You have to have the environment, remember, because it becomes that, once again, that nature via nurture. And that's just one of my discussion questions. Just because you have the genotype, the gene for a behavior, does that mean that it's a lost cause if that's an undesirable behavior? Clearly you've shown, well, no, it isn't. We know it isn't. But does that increase your propensity for that behavior? Certainly. Absolutely. So can we override genes with environment? Sometimes you can. It depends what it is. In behavior, we have a better how can we override sickle cell anemia if we give you a conducive environment? No, we can't.
Gentleman over here. Yes, I just wanted to make a couple of comments.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have any statistical things or studies to back this up, but I work in a penal institution
Mm-hmm.
before. And the other kind of things that the lady was addressing, just like we were talking about, is the issue that the environment, you look at the environment of a structure of a prison. It's a breeding ground for more hostility, reinforcement of aggressive acts, reinforcement of the pathology that was there, and just reinforcing the information for the prisoners that are there, because the structure of the prisons are not rehabilitated.
Right. The old mantra of the penal system, the rehabilitation during incarceration, doesn't ring very true as your statement. It's not an environment that's conducive to rehabilitation. And so even if we were dealing with the genetic aspect, you're in an environment that's very, very toxic.
Any final questions or comments?
I once wanted to be the next Bobby Lane with respect to football. For some of the old people, he was quarterback for the Detroit Lions. Let me tell you, I didn't have the genes.
There you go.
I did play organized violence in high school. Well, football. We have a number of organized violent sports, such as hockey, football, and so on. And I participated in those, but I did not have the physique, the genes.
Even though you had the behavioral adaptation and tendency and tried, and if you were today, Mom would have sent you to 45 football camps, and it wouldn't have translated into success.
I
Or the jersey.
Being a nerd worked.
There you go. Well, folks, thank you very much for your attention, and watch your behavior. We'll see you later.